All right, well, good morning, everyone, and thank you all for joining us for this important conversation about anti-Asian hate. I'm Marie Torres, president of the National Association of Black Journalists, Raleigh Durham, executive producer at Spectrum News 1 in North Carolina, and co-founder of Carolina Black Media. In recognition of Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, NABJ chapters across the state, including our Raleigh Durham, Triad, Charlotte area chapters, as well as the North Carolina chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists, band together to denounce violence against Asian communities. That statement, jointly released on May 1st, can be viewed on all of our active social media platforms. The purpose of today's event is to go even further, dive deeper, and work in solidarity to address the issues of bias and racism that impacts all of our communities. Today, you will hear from our esteemed panelists about their work, their struggles, their successes, and their hope for the future. As with all of our meetings and discussions, this is a safe space and place where we all show great respect for one another. So here are some housekeeping rules. We will open our discussion with a round of planned questions to get to know our panelists, then open the floor to all attendees. Our panelists will mute and unmute themselves as they respond. Attendees will have two ways to participate in the discussion. To be called upon to ask your question, you can select the raised hand icon, which will appear under the More option, which should be in the top right corner. Please remain muted until called upon to ask your question, and then mute after asking your question. If you would like our moderator to ask a question for you, type your question in the chat. You will now hear from Simone Jasper, breaking news reporter for the News and Observer and secretary for NABJ-Raleigh Durham, as she introduces our panelists and moderator for today's discussion. Simone.
Thank you, Marie. And thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm so excited to introduce our esteemed panelists. First off, we have Renee Chou. She's a 3-time Emmy Award-winning reporter and anchor for WRAL TV. You can catch her on air every morning and anchoring the noon newscast. She joined WRAL in 2004 after working at stations in Iowa and Missouri. She's won multiple awards over the years and is a founding member and past president of the North Carolina chapter of the Asian American Journalists Association. Welcome. Next, we have Mario Benavente. He is an activist and a first-generation American. He was born in South Korea, and his father's U.S. Army service brought his family to Fort Bragg in Fayetteville, North Carolina, where he grew up with a mix of cultures. He graduated from UNC Chapel Hill, and this fall he'll be in his 3rd year of law school at North Carolina Central University. He's most interested in civil rights law and hopes to serve his hometown as a criminal defense attorney. Welcome. Next, we have Ricky Leung. He's co-founder and senior director of programs at North Carolina Asian Americans Together. He grew up in Greensboro, North Carolina, and studied journalism and mass communication at UNC Chapel Hill. He started his career in DC and became involved with Asian American grassroots organizers. He eventually returned to North Carolina in 2010 and worked at NC Policy Watch before joining North Carolina Asian Americans Together full-time. And last but not least, I want to introduce Steve Rao. He is believed to be the longest serving Asian American elected official in North Carolina and the first Indian American elected official in Wake County. He's a native of Charleston, West Virginia, and eventually ended up in Morrisville, where he serves as an at-large council member for the town. While in office, he's led efforts to start a growing entrepreneurship program, English as a second language classes, and has worked to bring over $300 million of transportation investment to the town. He's served on multiple boards, and advises technology companies on state and local government business development strategy. In addition, he hosts a new radio show called Leaders and Legends on the region's first South Asian radio station. Welcome to all of our panelists. And next, I want to introduce Beverly Mahone, who will be our moderator. Beverly is a veteran journalist who has spent more than 35 years in radio and TV news. In addition to working as a professional writing consultant at North Carolina Central University, she moderates a monthly conversation on racism and social justice on YouTube. She also has on Zoom. She also has a video podcast called The Boomer Beat, which airs on YouTube. Welcome, and I'll hand it over now.
And thank you so very much, and welcome to all of the panelists. As our president said, we are going to have a very important discussion today about the relationships in the Asian American community as it relates to the rest of the United States. Just a couple of facts here before I jump in and ask the first question. The Asian American story has roots that reach across the borders and spans oceans. Now, according to the 2019 US Census data, roughly 87.8% of all Asians in the US 25 and older had at least a high school diploma, as compared to 93.3% of non-Hispanic whites. On the other hand, 55.6% of Asian Americans have a college degree compared to just 36.9% of whites. And this is according to the US data. Now, some of the myths that I know I have had these myths in this country is that Asians are smart, they're all wealthy, and they're very docile. So that is my question. How much of that is myth? How much of that is somewhat true? And let's start with you, Council Member Rao.
Okay, could you go through those 3 myths again? Just repeat them for me.
That you're all smart, wealthy, and docile.
Well, I know there's many Asian Americans that are smart, and I'm not going to claim to be one of them. Although I think that one thing I'll say from just the perspective of being the son of immigrants, and I know Renee could probably attest to the same along with anyone here, is just a really hard work ethic. So there are many Asian Americans that have done very well in this country, but they came to America with just a few dollars in their pocket, like my father, like my uncle, like many folks. And through sacrifice and leaving everything that they've loved and known, they came to a country to brave freedom in a new world. So, just when you say docile, I think the tradition of culture has been to adapt, to learn, to listen, to just work hard. And so, but I think there's this notion that all these Asians are rich and that they didn't make sacrifices, they didn't work hard. We don't experience racism because we look differently. Those are all, myths as well. And so I hope that answers your question. And it's sort of a hard question, but, I think that, at the end of the day, for me, I'll just close out with this. I'm feeling a lot of distance of immigration today, being in a town of Morrisville with 40% of our population being from India, who can't bury their mothers and fathers, and they can't see their loved ones die. In India, 4,300 people are dying a day. And it's just, I'm about to get emotional because I've been spending so much of my time on the phone with families in Morrisville and Cary, trying to tell them it's gonna be okay. And to me, that just shows the courage of the Asian community, that we often forget that a mother like Fareed Zakaria, who is in Renee's profession, live on the GPS show, he said that he could not say bye to his mother, Fatima Zakaria, who was a well-known journalist, but he reminded everyone of the distance of immigration, right? So that's what I think Asians should be given credit for, is the courage that they've had to leave a weeping mother in tears who let Fareed leave at a young age to come become one of the best journalists in the world, right? So, sorry I went over my time.
That's quite all right. Renee, would you like to piggyback off of that?
Sure, Beverly, thanks. I think when we talk about stereotypes for any particular race or ethnicity, I mean, you're putting a broad brush on people. You're, of course, you're always going to have people of every race fitting certain adjectives and descriptions. The smart is that model minority myth. It seems like it's a good stereotype, but a stereotype is still just that. There are many Asian Americans who are and smart's not the right word, but it's just struggling and, to get access to education, right? To find those opportunities in education and advancement in their careers as well. That has nothing to do with their intelligence, but also the systems that are in place. There is, I think, at least in my family and other Asian Americans that I grew up with, that our families, the immigrant culture, as far as coming here and learning and education being the key, that has always been the driver. My parents are from Taiwan. My father came to the US to pursue his PhD at Michigan State University in safety research engineering, and worked for Ford for his whole life, for decades. And that was something that he wanted, he sought. He came here for that, and fell in love with the US despite all the challenges and hardships of learning language and finding community. And that was his key to raising a family and building a life here. And that was passed down to my brother and me, that it was just understood that we were going to do well in school, that was expected of us, and that we were going to college, and that was important to building a life. So that was always intrinsic in our culture, my family culture, and the way I grew up, that education was the key. Wealthy, well, there are different, certainly degrees of income among all communities as well. And the Crazy Rich Asians, I think of that movie. Certainly that was eye-opening for me. I'd never seen that, but you have those extremes. And then of course you have those who are owning their own business and trying to, make a living as well. And the docile part, that's interesting that you use that word. I think typically a lot of Asian Americans have not been active, have not been able to, and I'm talking about maybe my parents' generations and those that come here, because they came here and they just they kept their head down, they worked hard, and they thought that was the way that they could fit in this country, that they could just, do their thing, even though they experienced the hardships and the racism and all that. And what we're seeing now, especially in this current generation, is this inflection point of activism that we're seeing with especially those who are born here, who are Asian Americans, to finally finding their voice and standing up and being able to say, when they see a wrong, to speak up about that. Part of that, the docileness or trying to remain invisible or just trying to blend in, has been something that we've seen in Asian American families, but that is certainly starting to change with what we're seeing now.
All right, great, thank you. Now, Renee brought up the phrase model minority. So Ricky and then Mario, I want to ask you, what does it mean to be a quote unquote model minority? And do you find that offensive, or are you okay with it?
Thank you so much for asking, Beverly. And I think and thank you, Renee, for bringing up this really important concept of the model minority myth, which is very dangerous for all communities of color. And we think that oh yeah, we're lauding the accomplishments of our communities, when it is really rooted in a white supremacy to divide and put a racial wedge within our communities. There's a longer, much longer context of this model minority myth, and it also relates to another myth called it's the perpetual foreigner myth, like the concept that like a lot of Asian Americans are recent immigrants, have only just gotten here, first or second generation, when the context is that you know, the first Filipinos in the United States, or in what is now the United States, actually arrived in the 1500s, 33 years before Plymouth Rock. And there's been settlements of Filipino Americans in Louisiana since the 1700s, and records of South Asian folks in the Northeast since the late 1700s as well. So it's like, and a lot of the earlier Asian American immigrants, migrants who come over the U.S. are also brought over, or you know, came over in a more like working class labor status, right? Like as we, some of folks might be remember of like the gold mines in California and transcontinental railroads. So this like model minority myth is really like a descriptor of a more like recent wave of immigration post 1965. You know, there's been like almost a century bar of immigration from Asian countries previously, prior to 1965. Longer story, but the result is that like because of the Immigration Act of 1965, a lot of more recent immigrants from Asian countries have been more selective for folks who are of higher socioeconomic status. At the same time, we also need to be cognizant of the imperialism of American military actions across Asia that has also brought a lot of refugee populations to the United States throughout the country, including in North Carolina. And so I bring that up because within this Asian American umbrella is such a broad swath of communities from all different backgrounds and from all different socioeconomic status. And recently, there's also been a trend of a growing wealth gap within the Asian community that is eclipsing other communities of color as well, where the folks with the lowest income, lowest earning status are something like less than 10 times or more than those of the highest income Asian Americans as well. And I actually have a chart I wanted to quickly share. If it's all right if I share my screen real quick. I just wanted to share this. I have disabled, sorry. Because it is like a chart that will, yeah, thank you. Kind of shed light a little bit more. If you can see, like this is like data about educational attainment and limited English proficiency for Asian American communities, disaggregated by various populations. And you'll see that like for limited English proficiency in North Carolina, for example, Vietnamese populations have a higher rate of limited proficiency, much more so than Asian, Indian, and Filipino communities in North Carolina, for example. And it's a similar trend in educational attainment. So I bring that up to say that like it's really important when we think about Asian and talk about Asian American communities that we strive to look at it in a very disaggregated way and not group everyone together as like the model minority myth does. And one of the very important dangers of that is when we talk about, oh, Asian Americans are such high income earners, then that affects the policies to be able to help folks who are of lower income, right? Like we also see that particularly in the pandemic, where there may be more language and other access barriers for things like PPP loans and access to PPP loans, to vaccines and education around things that will help our communities. Sorry for that very long answer.
Okay, that's fine. All right, so Mario, Mario, you want to piggyback off of that?
Yeah, that was excellent, Ricky. I mean, I've learned so much kind of working alongside Ricky with a lot of these issues. So it's really great to have him here kind of explaining the meat and potatoes of it like that. I think the biggest thing about the model minority myth, Ricky kind of touched on it. I hate the way that it's used to sort of pit our community against other minority communities, as if, why can't you just be like the Asian Americans? As if, we aren't going through the same struggles, and we're not, let's be honest, we're more on over here with our fellow minority communities, sort of fighting against a lot of the oppressive forces that we all have to deal with. I have a really difficult time with, terms like the docile, diminutive, we're overly accommodating, we're submissive to a lot of things that happen. And, it's a problem because, I think Councilman WRAL probably knows this with his entrepreneurship work. A lot of Asian Americans are, performing really well in their business work or, within companies, and they're not heads of their companies. They're not CEOs. They're not, law firm partners. They're looked at in a certain way as if, they don't have that, sort of killer instinct or whatever you want to call it to be that in that leadership role. And I think it's really disappointing because obviously, you've got people that certainly can do the work and do the job, but they are just perceived immediately because of the way they look, that they're somehow less than or not leaders. And so that part's tough. And I think just like Renee was mentioning, I think we're seeing that change. We're starting to see Asian Americans, excited and sort of emboldened to take over some of these activist spaces and speak on these issues. And that's certainly where I've found myself sort of talking with my peers about how important it is for us to take this time and join in, Black Lives Matter movement demonstrations, in different occasions where we can let folks know that, we're not your model minority. We're not going to sort of sit here in a corner and just sort of let these things happen to fellow minority communities. And so I think we're working on dispelling sort of, I think, the ways that this model minority myth has been used to kind of keep folks divided and to try and keep others, really quiet. So I think we're going to come out and start using our voice a lot more moving forward.
Councilman Rao, is there something you wanted to add to that?
Well, let me just take a shot, first of all, on, it's not a topic of today, but I do think it's very important to address. One myth out there today that I hear a lot is that, Asian Americans are taking American jobs and that, we need to make America great again with President Trump. And, as we speak today, there are 50, 60,000 Indian Americans or Asian Americans that are waiting for their green cards to become citizens of this country. And, President Biden has addressed this by accelerating the path to citizenship with, bills on the floor of Congress. But I think it's important for people to understand the tremendous economic impact that Asian Americans are making. If you look at North Carolina, 18% of our STEM graduates, 35% of our software developers, if we accelerated the path to citizenship for our international students and those who are here from India and China to become citizens, we would actually increase our GDP in North Carolina by 745 million. And the fact of the matter is, without immigrants, particularly Asian immigrants, we wouldn't have a Zoom, we wouldn't have a Yahoo, and Google and Tesla and all of these great American companies were founded in America by immigrants who came, many from Asia. So this is a tremendous myth that has to be addressed. And I think it's important to address it with Asian hate because we're all Americans. And, the fact is, by targeting one group, it sends a bad message to our own community, but also to the rest of the world. My late father-in-law came to America when he saw with his older brother, Neil Armstrong, setting foot on the moon. And he decided to come to the United States and alongside his wife, rank of colonel in the United States Air Force. And when we see what's going on today with grandmothers and people beaten down like that, what message is that sending to India or to China or to any other country in the world? Why would I want to come to the country that's been an inspiration to us? So I hope that answers your question, but I think immigration is important, the reform of it, because so much of the discussion has been on the border, which is important, and the undocumented immigrants, which I believe we need to give access to America, but we haven't been talking about the skilled immigrants. And I forgot to mention, they make up about 75.5% of our workforce. All of this information is from the New American Economy. I wish I could claim it was data from my own, not my own brain, but it's from the New American Economy, which is a bipartisan organization that's compiling economic data about immigrants. But that's what I would follow up to what is being said.
Well, Renee, you're the one who brought it up. So is there anything you want to add to that?
Well, another thought that came to me was when you opened this up and you talked about all the different ethnic groups that make up Asian Americans, 30 plus ethnic groups. I think one microaggression and one common experience that a lot of Asian Americans have is people always asking them where they're from and where they're really from and what's their nationality. And I know it can be intimidating, overwhelming sometimes, and with others trying to understand, okay, well, how do I address this? And the point is, the simple thing is, a conversation started when you say, where are you from? And the person says, oh, I'm from San Diego, California, and then, okay. If what you're really wanting to know, or if that becomes another follow-up question, you can ask, what's your ethnicity? Or just tell me about your background or something like that. What's your nationality? That's an interesting question as well, because nationality refers to, you're a citizen of a particular country. So if you were to ask me what my nationality is American. I'm American. I have a US passport and I was born in the US. But if you're wanting to know more, right, and you can't even really ask where your parents are from necessarily, because I happen to be first generation Asian American. There are plenty, who have been, are 8 generations in, of where, the parents or grandparents or great grandparents immigrate from. So even just those questions can certainly, and how you ask them can certainly affect your interaction and a conversation that perhaps that you want to start. And I'm just speaking this as maybe journalists approaching other Asian Americans as they're covering stories and communities to start out, to be asking the right questions there that can open doors, right, as opposed to closing them. So that's just a particular thing I think a lot of Asian Americans can understand, as far as, who are you, or, or those kinds of situations, to avoid those awkward encounters.
That's a good point, because according, again, to the US Census data, in lumping all Asian Americans together with Pacific Islanders and all of the other nationalities, the group itself now is comprised of 22.9 million, which puts Asian Americans ahead of African Americans when it comes to the population. Speaking of which, we talked about the myths of being smart, being wealthy, and being docile. That's not something, or that's not 3 words that would describe African Americans, of course. I'm sure you know that. So my question to you is, what do you believe Asian Americans have in common with African Americans and Mexican Americans? Who wants to start answering that question? Mario, would you like to take that one first?
Sure. I'm half Korean. My father is from Peru. So, certainly I grew up in, a lot of Latin American community spaces. My Spanish is a little stronger than my Korean, and certainly growing up in Fayetteville, I went to, majority African American high school at E.E. Smith in Fayetteville, right next to Fayetteville State University. And certainly, now I go to an HBCU law school. And, I think the common space is really start and end with just the way folks, they'll look at us and they other us, right? You are non-white, and it's obvious. There is no passing. There is no, sort of mincing of the words about it. And I think in a lot of ways, there's this expectation on all of us to have to overcompensate and having to, do just 10 times more in order to get ahead, or to show that we are actually achieving the American dream, or we're getting to the places that we want to get to in our careers. And we know that it's not going to be as easy for us as it might be if we were just, white Americans or a part of the majority. And so I think we all understand that for those reasons, all the ways that we can kind of link arm in arm and walk that walk together, that's probably been the biggest place of commonality that I found with my brothers and sisters in the African American community, because there's not a lot of explanation that needs to happen about feeling othered, or feeling like it's just hey, this is a steep climb in it. And it's just like, yes, you know, we're both kind of just nodding in agreement. And so just kind of being able to skip a couple of steps in sort of understanding each other's unique struggles, because certainly they are still very, very different in so many other ways as well. We will both understand, you know, sort of what that feels like.
Hey, Zach.
And so
Trying to get to you.
Oh, I think it's exactly for those reasons that it's a sort of fast friends. You know, it's sort of an ability to recognize that struggle that each of us face, and you know, being more than willing to kind of try and support each other in the journey forward.
Ricky, would you like to add to that?
Sure. I mean, I think I will bring back kind of the historical context of how this country is founded on white supremacy, and not like a lot of our communities of color are struggling like against that like core struggle. And I pointed that in like you know, even in terms of citizenship back in the early 1900s, when citizenship was denied to Asian communities on the basis of that like they're not white, and there are these Supreme Court cases of like defining whiteness and defining what American citizenship is, as it like very solidly like connects to whiteness. And then, as I have mentioned before, the creation of the model minority myth as a wedge for communities of color. I think a lot of like of our communities movements from other parts of the world were also based on movements of labor, populations brought over to this country for their labor. In a more positive note, what I've also seen is movements of solidarity among our communities, and there's also historical context of that also like counters that myth of the docility. What's the word for that? For example, in the 1960s, in the labor movement, where Filipino labor workers, Larry Leung and Philip Vera Cruz, worked alongside Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta out west in the labor movement. And then we also saw Yuri Kochiyama working alongside Malcolm X in the 1960s as well. You know, they even share a birthday that doesn't necessarily have to do with them working together, but the interesting point to note, and that was actually just a few days ago. And I also point to the Immigration Act that I brought up earlier before in 1965, and like you know, interestingly, year of 1965, because it has a direct link to the civil rights movement, right? Like it's because of that struggle of like civil rights, common struggle of civil rights that led to the Immigration Act in 1965 that ended that century-long exclusion of Asian migration to the U.S. And then I would also bring up that in terms of undocumented communities, I think that is also something that to be aware that is also like not a issue that just impacts Latino communities, right? There are Black and Asian immigrants who are undocumented and in the shadows. And so like there is also important to continue to be in solidarity to fight for a better future.
Let me ask this question, because I don't know how many of you are on Twitter. I'm a Twitterholic, but one of the issues that I've seen raised is the fact that some Blacks are resentful of the fact that all of a sudden now we're supposed to jump on your bandwagon and support you because we've been going through the same things for hundreds of years, and we've never seen you come out and support us ever. So how do you address that issue? What do you say to that? Council Member Rao, you want to take that one?
Well, that's a very interesting point. I mean, I serve actually on the North Carolina League of Municipalities Task Force on Racial Equity. And one of the things I learned during this process is, I got to be honest with you, I have always identified with the stigmas of race and racism against Black Americans, but I now believe that I haven't done enough in my own lifetime when I see the data that's now coming out that only 40% of Black Americans own homes, 13% of Black men are in prisons, just the stigma and bias that's existed. And so I think that I personally can say I've done my part, I've tried to do my best, but I think we as Asian Americans have to stand up together with the Black community and say that we are going to fight together. And that's why I wore purple today. I'm always selective about what color I'm going to wear, because I think this is a bipartisan issue and Republicans and Democrats have to do what is right. But I think Asians need to step up and do things like, come to the Martin Luther King prayer breakfast in the morning that David Crabtree hosts. There's a notion out there, well, it's a Black holiday. No, it's not a Black holiday. It's an American holiday. My great-grandfather was the Speaker of the House in the largest state in India, and he left to join Mohandas K. Gandhi's freedom movement. And I'm always amazed that Dr. King was inspired by Gandhi. This is the greatest connection we can feel as Americans with Black Americans. And so to answer your question, that's what I think we can do, but we can remind ourselves that the thing that I sometimes think about this before I go to bed, what amazes me about, I wish I could go back in a time machine and meet my great-grandfather, but what was it like to be in India in the 1930s when one man with 5 people in a room said, I want to free from the British Empire. They thought he was crazy. When Dr. King did it, all of these leaders did things that were uncomfortable. They had conversations that were not comfortable to have, and look what it did to their countries. And that's what we have to do. It's easy for me as an Indian American or an Asian American to go home and do my thing and go back home and say, well, Black Lives Matter, someone got, I'm going to turn the TV off and forget about it. We can't forget about it, right? So anyway, I hope I've answered your question. I think it's about trying to understand, and what I've learned from it, I'll just close out with this, that I believe today that I cannot say as a son of immigrants from India that I've experienced anywhere close to the racism that Black Americans have experienced. And the reason I say that is that my ancestors did not come to this country on slave ships in chains. Mm-hmm. They were not beaten on plantations. They were not separated from their families. So yes, my parents and my father made sacrifices, but whatever they came to was better than what they had before. That's all I have to say about that.
Renee?
Yeah. Beverly, thank you so much for bringing up this particular point and the importance of allyship and how we can work toward that, right? First of all, just the fact that NABJ is putting on this panel today, and during May, AAPI Heritage Month is a perfect example of that allyship. And I'm very appreciative and grateful that you've reached out to all of us to put together this panel. And thanks to the participants who have jumped on this panel to listen to this. I think discussing Asian-related hate and bigotry toward Asians does not take away from other injustices. It doesn't take away from Black Lives Matter. It doesn't take away from, migrant children who are being detained. They're all injustices, right? And we're seeing that's what's happening in our country, and we're standing up for those injustices. I think what it's making us realize is that we, as Asian Americans, have to be better allies as well, because we realize that what we have in common, in answer to your first question, what do we have in common, is that we all know what it's like not to be white. I mean, we all know what it's like to be judged on our skin color. We all know what it's like to be treated in a condescending, harassing, demeaning manner. Those are commonalities in our struggles, and certainly within the AAPI community, we can learn to be better allies, and we realize that importance. And in this year of racial reckoning, that is that awareness that we are stepping into, and that we vow to do better, because we do see everything else that is going on in this country with Black Lives Matter and coming up on George Floyd's anniversary. And so we understand that that is an important point, and we vow to do better. Oh, you're muted.
Thank you, Renee. Now, Mario, it's easy to spot you in a crowd. So when you are protesting in Fayetteville and the Black Lives Matter, we all can see you. So we know that you are an ally. So what does it what do you think that we have in common that we should be using to continue to push the envelope forward?
Yeah, thank you so much, Beverly. Yeah, I know I can kind of come out there and just kind of be sticking out like a sore thumb sometimes. But you know, there's actually a good friend of mine that kind of really inspired me to make sure I'm always in those spaces. She's also a fellow Korean American named Heather Redding, and you'll probably see her a lot of times in the Graham, Alamance County, some of those tougher communities that are dealing with, you know, the Confederate sort of, you know, flagging and things like that. She's such a powerful role model for me. She's been in Elizabeth City a lot, working on that. So I just kind of want to give her a quick shout out when you talk about just kind of Asian Americans kind of entering these activist spaces, because it is important. And I'm hoping that it's something that the way that she sort of inspired me to do that, you know, hopefully folks seeing me out there will again just go say, hey, we are sort of allowed here, kind of like Councilor Rao was saying, you know, MLK Day is not a Black holiday. This is not necessarily simply, you know, a struggle for Black Americans, a struggle for, you know, justice, equal justice for everyone. That's what Black Lives Matters movement is really about, equal justice for each and every one of us under the law. So, you know, just making it commonplace. And when I hear sort of, Ms. Beverly, what you were talking about, this sort of, you know, minor sort of backlash about, you know, the hate bills, Asian American hate bills kind of, you know, being fast tracked and things like that, you know, whereas maybe some folks might feel defensive about it, you know, I really do feel much more like Renee was speaking about. It just seems like more of a call to action on us to say, hey, if that is the immediate feeling that the you know, parts of the African American community are feeling, then it's up to us to then sort of, you know, fix that, you know, and sort of say that, no, this isn't back in the day. This isn't, you know, sort of the LA riots, sort of, stereotypes that, you know, people I think still kind of hold as the last thing they remember between Black and Asian Americans in this country. This is a new day, and we need to redefine what that relationship is. And it's not going to be a sort of, you know, be defensive about it at all. It has to be from a place of, oh, it makes sense that this would be frustrating to see or to hear, that, you know, that the ball has, you know, hasn't necessarily been carried as far as it needs to be for Black Americans. And that's where we would have to come in and say, hey, you know, we appreciate, you know, these bills, but that's not enough. You know, what about our other brothers and sisters? And so, you know, making sure that we say that every time that we get a chance to is what it's going to take. And so I'm just looking forward to just constantly being present in these spaces. And I know that there's going to be more and more folks coming in after me because of that.
Thank you. We do have a question from one of our members. So Mark, would you ask your question, please?
Sure. I'm glad to do that. Glad to ask the question. Also glad to see Councilman Rao here. We actually work on a program together in the streaming podcast world where we do the World Edition. So he usually brings me in as a panelist. So glad to see Councilman Rao here. One of the things that we've talked about on that show, and I'd love to hear from the other panelists as well, and it's a follow-up question, is a lot of times when you talk to your friends and your acquaintances, and even folks that know that you have Asian allies, they oftentimes will bring up the question of the intentional separation of Asians in the community. Because a lot of times, like even here in North Carolina, you'll find a large Asian population that is there together in Cary. And sometimes people in the community feel that that's almost an intentional separation, almost as if they're not trying to identify with folks in the African American community and in the other communities as well. So I'd love to hear from the panelists their thoughts on that. And just as a follow-up, they will sometimes add, coming back to Mario's point, the kind of fears that came out of some of Spike's movies, where some of the population of Asian Americans were coming into our communities as owners, but then they were going back into their own communities and not necessarily having that much interaction. But I'd love to hear folks' thoughts on those questions that I sometimes get asked.
I could take a stab at that because I get asked that question a lot in my role. And what's ironic for me is that when I grew up in West Virginia, the Indian Association was 5 people: my mom, my dad, me, my godfather, and 2 other, maybe 6 people, with an Indian meal once a night, once a week at someone's house. And I just look at where my children live now, where, you know, 40% of Indian Americans in Morrisville are here, and in Cary, it's just huge amounts. And so sometimes people in the community will approach me privately and say, why are there such large Indian gatherings? Like Cary Diwali is a lot, you know, like maybe 10,000 people at Cocoa Booth Amphitheater. I think part of the answer to that question, Mark, is that typically when many of the Indian American immigrants that are here, I can speak for Indian American, have come within the last 5 to 9, 10 years. And so when that happens, whenever you come to a new country, you tend to want to go back to where you are from, where you have common music and culture. The other thing people don't realize is that India has over 18 languages. And even though English is the national language and Hindi, there's so many different dialects. And so it's almost like the former Soviet Union, where when you go to somebody and you say, "Are you from India?" They won't say, "I'm from India." They'll say, "I'm from Gujarat," where Prime Minister Modi's from, or they'll say, "I'm from Maharashtra," or "I'm from, some Indian state," right? So I think that's why I don't think it's so much an intentional thing, but I think that we have to figure out a way to, like, for example, on Carry Diwali, having more of an opportunity to educate people about what Diwali is. It's actually not a Hindu festival. It's the festival of lights, and it symbolizes light over darkness. So this is something that all North Carolinians and all Americans can, particularly during the pandemic, as we come out of COVID, and then also open up the churches so that we can learn from, the different churches, and then they can come in and learn from the temples. And so having that exchange so that we can learn from each other. And I'll close out with my mother, who's one of my heroes. When we were living in West Virginia, she started a club that was just on our street to have people understand about Indian cultures. So why did she wear a sari? Why did she have she used to wear a dot on her head. And then we would learn from the Jewish culture and the Christian culture. And it actually changed my life as a young kid, because I got to see that we had to really accept each other and learn from each other. But if you don't take that first step, it's easy for people to assume, well, it's just a bunch of Indians congregating. They didn't give me a call. Councilman Rao, why are fireworks going off in my neighborhood? It's not July 4th, it's October.
Right. All right. Well, listen, thank you very much for your response. Time is winding down here. This has just been such a wonderful discussion. We could probably go another hour, but we can't. I do have one final question that is being asked here. Simone, do you want to ask the question?
Sure. Renee sort of alluded to this in her question, but I'm wondering, as journalists, if you have any other tips for us when we're covering Asian American communities, or even in particular, recent incidents of violence in the country. Is there anything we should keep in mind as media professionals when perhaps going out and covering these topics? I guess maybe it would be appropriate to start with Renee. You may, as a fellow media professional.
And if you can kind of keep your comments maybe a minute or less, because time is winding down. Thank you.
What I will say about that, Simone, I think newsrooms in general, local TV news, we're very good at reactionary. We're very good at, there's some disaster in some country or in our own country, right? And then we automatically go to that ethnic community and we want to get reaction, and we cover that, or we cover those rallies and things. My hope is that after those die down, after those rallies die down, to circle back to those communities, the people that you talked with, or to make an extra effort to reach out to the people you spoke with, or other organizations that you hadn't heard of, but once you covered that story, you did, to circle back with them and ask them how they're doing, what else is happening. Is there something else that you think our viewers or our audience need to be aware of, and to make time for those stories, because that's important, as well as we establish trust and build those relationships with those communities.
Awesome. Ricky?
Yeah, thank you. I'll try to keep that in a minute. I think, echoing what Renee said, building relationships with community members and organizations beyond the moment, avoiding voyeurism, where, when we're getting comments from community members, to be like, I avoid things like, I just want to see what your everyday is like, and go into your homes and see how you cook and how that's different. I've had comments from community members that I've felt bad about connecting with reporters who have told me that it felt like being looked at in zoo or something like that. So because how is my life any different from my neighbors? And then last thing is like research and historical context on what's and really looking at the root causes of what's happening before jumping on the story. Really kind of like a lot of the things that we talked about today, like being familiar with like the model minority myth, the perpetual foreigner myth, and the importance of disaggregation of data is really important. And really like kind of bringing back that critical race theory lens and racial equity, because like we see now that it's going to be like legislated out of our schools, that like people aren't going to have context to that. So that's very important to have that lens in for our community members in other areas of life.
All right, thank you. Councilmember Rao?
Well, I mean, I think Renee has done a great job laying out sort of what the media can do. As a city councilor, and I think, what we can do is have policies at the local government level, developing what we call anti-racist policies, different procedures and policies, looking for bias that exists in all the different departments, but obviously starting with law enforcement. And then at the federal level, President Biden's headed in the right direction as he signed the Asian American hate crime. And I think in North Carolina, we really need the Republicans and Democrats to come together and pass the anti-crime bill that was sponsored by Senator Chou, Senator Fashy, and Senator Mohammed, because I think it sends a real strong message that North Carolina is leading on this. So I think we have a lot of work to be done, but I think the important thing is the media. We want to thank the Black Journalists Association, along with all of the great work that WRAL does and the community stations to bring awareness for these issues, because it makes it easier to have these conversations.
And Mario?
Yeah, if there was any little helpful hints, maybe just for any story, maybe not just the Asian American stories or stories that specifically go towards our community, but just the general sort of things happening around town, going ahead and including Asian Americans in those topics as well, even though it might not be specifically directly related to them. Because I've even noticed, some of our local journalists have had to call me and says, Mario, we don't know any other Asian people but you. And so when we're tired of quoting you. So, that way, you're kind of already doing the homework with a lot of these other articles you might have done throughout the year. So now you've kind of grown your sort of, where then when the hot topic comes up, you already know where everyone's at, if you will. So that would be a little one there. But we've got Akila Davis here in Fayetteville. So she's like my go-to person whenever we're doing anything. I know I can always call her. So it's really a blessing to have our Black journalists in my community so prominent and so effective. So shout out to her as well.
We have so many more questions that we could ask, but we cannot ask them. So we're going to have to wrap this up and turn it back over to our chapter presidents. But any closing remarks, and if you can keep them to 30 seconds or less, we would appreciate that as well. And we will start with Ricky.
Thank you. I think one thing that comes up for me that I hadn't touched on that came up in the conversation is I think it's really important for Asian communities ourselves to also confront the anti-Blackness that is very real in Asian communities. And I know that we are doing the work, and NCAT is, definitely that is one thing that we work on as well. And that is one part of I know that our community is working on throughout. So that's the one thing that I also want to uplift.
Thank you. Councilman Rao?
Well, I just think that there's so much work to be done. During this pandemic, we have had the vaccine be able to save lives. But the one thing with the issues we're talking about, there's no shot you can take to eliminate racism or bias. It's something we know exists. It can't be diagnosed in a medical exam, but we have to get rid of it. And like President Biden said, it's a poison. And the way we're going to get rid of the poison is by working together, all of us. And so thank you all for having the courage to do all the great work you're doing. And I've been honored to be a part of the panel. I was a little bit nervous being on a panel with Renee Chou, but hope I did okay. But thank you so much. And I think we have so much work to do. It's just the beginning, and let's make it happen.
Mario? Thank you, Councilman. Mario?
Yeah, I mean, I just see nothing but, great things in the future. K-pop is all popular, but why? It's because, they're learning sort of, African-American dance moves and R&B style. I don't know. That's just one of the little things I think about. Like, our communities are kind of growing and growing together, and it's going to continue to grow together. And I just want to be a part of that. I just want to help facilitate that. And certainly events like this are exactly how we do it. So just looking forward to seeing more and more things like this. And then just both of our communities sort of continuing to just get to that next level.
Renee, and Renee, if you did not answer the question that Gail has in the chat, would you also kind of answer that as well as you wrap up your comments?
Oh, yes. Hi, Gail. It's good to see you. She had asked if I'm feeling a lot of support as an Asian American journalist, and that yes, we have a local chapter of AAJ, which I did help start back in 2005, but the numbers have dwindled incredibly, especially after the recession, 2008, 2009. But we're trying to build that chapter back up. But I am the only Asian American on air in our newsroom, and then a few behind the scenes. And what I can say is I think it can be lonely, it can be draining on certain things, but I also appreciate the allies that I have in the newsroom with other journalists of color who check on me and who also talk with me as we talk about the issues that we cover every day. And I think in this year of racial reckoning, I think we just realize how important it is to come together, because as a journalist, you will never see me out marching in a rally, probably just covering one. But that said, I think, what the voice that I can be is certainly advocating that coverage of communities of color, and finding those people and those stories, and really pitching those stories to our managers, saying why this is important and why our audience needs to hear these stories. That is something that I'm committed to doing, whether they are part of the AAPI community or the Black community or Hispanic community. All of that is important. And that's something that we continue to try to do at WRAL, having those conversations and really having our coverage reflect the community in which we serve.
Very good. Thank you so much. And now I am going to turn it back over to our wonderful president, Marie Torres.
Thank you all. Thank you so much, Beverly. Excellent job. Fantastic questions. I had a list of questions and I'm like, you hit them all out. I'm like, okay, I'm not even going to ask that. She's got it already. So just fantastic job. Oh my goodness. I love hearing from our speakers today. You all had some great information to share, some eye-opening and interesting information. And I want to say, Renee, in the future, if you ever want to, partner up with any event, like we're here, we're here virtually for now, but definitely in the future.
And again, big thanks to NABJ for putting this panel together and making this a priority and giving AAPIs a platform. We really, really do appreciate that. That is huge.
Absolutely. So yes, thank you so much for everyone who gave their thoughts and opinions. Just great information. Ricky, love that. Council member, I think if anybody was looking, there was a few sound bites I heard, right? I was like, oops, sound bite right there, like such great statements. And Mario, of course, I reached out to Mario after we had him on one of our Voices for Change segments, and I already saw him out with a bullhorn out at protests, and I'm like, look at, coming together. And I think honestly, what has really inspired me over the past year with just the different protests is seeing how very diverse those protests are. So definitely, especially on this month, we wanted to make sure that we're showing our us as allies, and then making sure that you all know that we're here as resources as well. So thank you again. I hope everyone really learned something. I know for sure I was enlightened by today's conversation. I did just really wanted to encourage anyone who may be new on here. Again, NABJ-RDU, we're on Facebook if you want to find out more about us. If you want to become a member, anyone can be a member. You can also just message us on Facebook and we can give you more information. So we're going to go ahead and conclude because it's it's noon now. We'll go ahead and conclude this discussion. But for any of our members, if you would just hang on, we'll have a really quick business portion. So we'll just go over a few officer reports and any other discussions about future events. So again, thank you so much to our guests and all of our attendees, and we hope you have a fantastic Saturday. Thank you so much for being with us.